Hello and welcome to Book Lovers Companion, the podcast about books, authors, their craft and more. My name is Edith, and today, joining me from across the pond is our second poet on the show, James W.A. Hello, James, and welcome on the show.
Hello, thank you. It's awesome to be here.
It's a great pleasure to have you on the show. And like I said in the introduction, you are only our second poet so far. James, another poet. Been a while since he was on. You are our second one. Francis Deloria was our first one. You are our second one. And I would like to talk about your book and how you came across the ideas for your poems, what inspired them, your process as a poet, because to be honest with you, and like I was honest with our first poet, I don't read that much poetry. I'm very honest here. And so it's an interesting process.
Oh, I appreciate that.
It's an interesting process to find out how it works for you as an author, and where you get your ideas from and how you put them into the poems. So, over to you.
Yeah, all right. Well, that's awesome. I guess we'll start with a process. Yeah, I've been writing poetry for probably more of my life than not now, I think. I've kind of dabbled on and off with prose, short stories and stuff. Nothing ever really stuck. For me at least, I have a hard time coming up with a full story in like a novel. I either have a really good beginning and like a no end, or I have like some cool characters I don't really know what to do with, or I have pieces. And so I have a lot of pieces of stuff. But I like poetry because it allows me to put whatever I'm feeling, whatever I'm thinking, whatever experiencing into kind of a more concise form, kind of pack that in and have a bunch of kind of smaller stories, as it were, instead of one big, novel or something like that. Um, I would say my process is a little maybe it's maybe unusual. I think a lot of poets, when they set out to, or maybe not, actually, I don't know, set out to write a book, kind of have an idea for what they want to write going into it. I kind of in the moment write whatever I'm thinking, whatever I'm feeling, whatever I'm kind of going through. I use it as kind of a tool to process stuff in a lot of ways. And then once I kind of feel that I have enough material, or I have a good enough premise for a book or a collection, that's when I'll kind of really hit the editing hard and kind of fine tune those poems and fine tune those ideas and compile them into a working collection that kind of fits a consistent theme. I'm really the worst. It's awful to say as a writer, but I'm really the worst at being sitting down and just saying like, "Hey, I'm gonna write today. I'm gonna write this today." I'm awful at that, which is a bad habit, and I'm not saying that's right. But it's kind of inspiration strikes when it does, and then we kind of go with it, and then edit later, as it were.
May I interrupt you here for a moment, because you said when inspiration strikes. I mean, is it not the case that it is, of course, different if you are a poet? Because you said, a prose didn't work for you. When you write a novel, you get a material, which means you do research and you cover everything you can get your hands on. If you write, for example, let's say historic fiction and so on, and then you start writing. You might, hit a wall where you think, okay, I've written myself in a corner. Let's think it over for a bit and then come back to it. But isn't it completely different for a poet?
I would say so. Yeah. I mean, there is research that goes into some things, right? If I want to, so I have a couple poems in here that call back to, some poets from antiquity or just history. A little bit of Robert Frost, a little bit of Petrarch, who was one of my favorite poets of all time. So there's some like research that goes into that, but you're right. It isn't a lot of like road mapping kind of what we're gonna write. It's more of just this is what I'm feeling. This is where we're at. It's more about getting the precision in the form itself, right? Making sure your punctuation is right. Making sure I like to experiment sometimes with like indents and kind of putting words into interesting shapes and stuff like that. So that's sort of the more process type fine tuning stuff. But it is totally different. It's totally different mindset than prose, I think,
Yeah, I can
traditionally.
imagine that because when I don't know, an idea strikes you or the muse kisses you, so to speak, um, it probably works completely different for you than it does for someone who writes novels.
Oh, for sure. And I tend to kind of, at least in the first I have kind of a process I like to do where the first time I write out an idea, when that inspiration strikes,
Mhm,
I'll write it out all on paper first, and I'll
mhm,
kind of try to do it in one burst, kind
mhm,
of let that where as far as those emotions carry me,
mhm,
or description if I'm describing scene of nature or something like that. Not a big nature guy, but every once in a while. um, and then either the next day or maybe that night, depending if it was early enough in the morning, but usually the next day.
uh-huh,
Then I'll go back and I'll type it,
okay.
and that kinda gives me a little bit of separation, because
Mhm,
sometimes in the moment, it can be, at least for me, kinda easy to get wrapped up in those emotions. Maybe things don't sound as eloquent as I want them to, maybe they're a little too raw, maybe they just sound just too
mhm,
all over the place.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so then I'll usually go back afterwards and kind of
mhm,
tune that a little bit,
mhm.
but try to get as much of it in one burst as we can.
And you said before, when you have enough material, do you mean enough material as in, enough poems to put out the
Yes.
yeah, okay, to put
Yep.
out your
I try to keep it
collection.
around this collection has about 96, I think, poems in it.
Mhm, mhm,
I like to keep it somewhere around 100. I am working on another book right now, which is gonna be a little bit
mhm,
longer, I think.
mhm,
But, kinda keep it around. I don't I tend to want to put it around plus or minus 100,
mhm, mhm,
as opposed to, like, a chat book or something like that.
mhm, mhm, I see. And what can you tell us about the title of this collection of poems, Desolation and Epiphany? How came that about?
Yeah. This collection, Desolation and Epiphany, it's kind of split into 2 halves. So the first half, the desolation half, is more sad, somber, melancholic, angry at times poetry. Um, and then the second half, Epiphany, is the more uplifting and inspirational. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's always happy, but sort of has resolutions from problems in the first half. There's technically a third section that's very, very short, and it's kind of like a we're going into the future kind of thing. And a lot of it came through. I kind of went through a time in my life where I was not in the best place. And, the word desolation, kind of at its core, means an emptiness, of a distance from love, a distance from hope, a distance from God, a distance from the things that bring us joy, the things that make us good and happy. Um, and so I kind of went through all the time where I wrote a lot of sad and melancholic type of stuff. Um, and then once I kind of got to a better place in my life, I wanted to kind of take my writing in a different direction and kind of write things that were a little more uplifting and a little more healthier, I suppose. And so I called it Epiphany, partially because it was sort of an epiphany moment, right? It's a rebirth, it's a discovery, but it's also, I didn't want to give the impression that, like, oh, everything's fine now. It's more of like a, we went through this. I wanted to show both sides of that journey. This is where we've been, and this is where we're going, and this is kind of how we've dealt with it and processed some of those things. If that makes
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely does. And you said drawing from life and from experience. And what came to mind was the idea of a novelist or novelists saying, write what you know. I mean, not all novelists can do that, especially if you
Oh,
write
sure.
sci-fi. You can't always
Oh,
write what you know.
of course.
Yeah. But uh, do you think that it is very, very important for a poet to draw from life and write about what they have experienced, um, versus for a novelist? I mean, they
Yeah,
can say so, write what you know, but it's not necessary
oh, sure.
uh, important to do so because you can put yourself in somebody else's shoes. I mean, that's what novelists do, what actors do. But for a poem, or for a poet who writes about feelings and experience, it's more important.
I think so. I mean, at least for myself, anytime I either force myself to write something or kind of experiment and try to get into a different perspective, it can come across as contrived maybe, or a bit, I don't wanna say fake, that's a strong word, but, I think by really tapping into real emotions and real experiences and real places, I think that authenticity shines through a bit more, and I think you can tell the poets um, who draw from that and those who don't. I mean, if you're a good enough writer, I guess you can step into a character and create that sort of persona. And that's not to say everything in my book is a one for one. This is an autobiography of my life. That's not true. There's some things that are over dramatized, right, for dramatic effect, or played off in a little metaphorical way. Metaphor is a big part of poetry as well. So, but I think you can. It's easy to tell the poems and the poets who draw from their own experiences for the sake of authenticity.
I absolutely agree, and I'm wondering if uh, you are an even more keen observer of humanity than novelists are. I mean, they are also observers of human emotions, human interactions. But would you say poets are even more keen observers than your average,
Yeah,
quote
no,
unquote
maybe the broad
average?
brush. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know if I would agree with that. I think it maybe depends on the genre, since there's a lot of different genres of poetry and novels in particular. I think some novelists are really good about, social commentary and maybe not observing human nature
Mm,
on a bigger scale, right? I think a lot of like the dystopian type of novels and
mm,
sort of the social commentary that comes with that. Um, and there are poets who kind of are more nature based and kind of,
mhm,
as a painter would observe
yeah.
something and try to recreate it. So some poets do that as well. Um, so I think on average, maybe, but I think it would definitely depend on what
Mm.
one's focus maybe is in either or. I think to be a poet, you do have to be kind of very self aware, for better or for worse. Um, so maybe that's a big part of it, maybe.
And where would you say poets live the most? I mean, some people live very much in their head, in their brains,
Yeah,
and other people more in their soul or heart. Where
yeah.
would you locate yourself?
I would say, for in my experience, myself included, most poets tend to be more heart centric, a little more right brain, a little more in their feelings and in their emotions. I would say I'm probably 70% on that. I kind of apply. It's funny because my day job is
Mm,
very technical, and I do a lot of like IT work and stuff like that.
okay.
So it is kind of that duality of man, I guess. But I would say, and that kind of helps in the logistics of poetry, I
Mm.
suppose. I would say most poets are probably more emotional though, and more heart driven.
It's interesting what you just said about your day job because I had a colleague and he taught or he still teaches math and physics.
Hmm.
And he was also an artist. He created statues with wood and all kinds of materials. So that was his outlet. So it's interesting that you need this. One would guess that these things are creative in a way, or too technical, and they need
Yeah,
this other kind of outlet of your emotions or your creativity.
yeah. I think both kind of, it's kind of two sides of the same coin there, and I think, at least in my life, I can only speak from my own experience, obviously, but I think they both kind of help the other. So
Mm-hmm.
I think my sort of left brain technical mind helps my poetry because I can kind of look at things in a more analytical way, or maybe a little more logistical way, right? I
Mm-hmm.
like to be very precise with how many lines are in a stanza and how many sometimes how the words line up on the page, and the exact wording in a poem at the beginning of the book referencing one at the end of the book, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of having that analytical mind to be able to do that helps with that, because I can kind of detach myself for a moment and get in the particulars. I guess maybe like as an artist, like a sculptor or something like that, right? You have to have the heart and the desire to
Mm-hmm.
create, but
Mm-hmm.
you've also got to have the technical skills to be able to do
Mm-hmm.
it, right? So it's kind
Mm-hmm.
of the same. I think that definitely helps me. It definitely helps me stay organized. I have an obnoxious spreadsheet of the poems I've written and when I wrote them and how many versions. I like to keep old versions of stuff, and that's not right or normal, perhaps, but it's where we're at. And I think the contrast too. The left brain side stuff, having that being in touch with my emotions and feelings
Mm,
helps kind of be make that a little more human as
mhm,
opposed to just too I don't know, corporate maybe or something. That's maybe the wrong
mhm,
word, but
mhm.
you know, yeah, it's good to have both. Could be a red runner person.
Yeah, interesting. And also interesting what you said about things you wrote and you kept on the side and maybe come back to them later.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I've had some poems that I worked on. I think the oldest poem in this book is
Mhm,
probably from the time this book came out, like 13 years old, 12
mhm,
years old. Obviously it was edited a lot. I've
mhm,
definitely gotten better as a writer in that
mhm,
past time.
mhm,
um, but there are definitely some poems I think are, and I have us kind of ranked in my stuff of this is a good idea, but maybe I'm too close to it to really fine tune it right now. Maybe it's a good concept, but this is not the right project for it. Maybe, I'll find a journal or something later
mhm,
I can maybe enter it in, or there's definitely things that have been sitting on the shelf for a while that come out, much, much later. And having that perspective helps too.
mhm,
Of sometimes that distance from the experience can really help put it into perspective better and maybe put it better in its right
mhm,
place.
mhm,
Or better, both good and bad.
mhm. And where do you draw inspiration from?
Say for the most part, it's the experiences that I have. I write a lot about people. I write a lot about relationships and things like that. Not necessarily romantic, but friends and I mean, I do write a lot about romance and not so much in this book so much as maybe future materials, but definitely the things that I'm feeling and perceiving. That's what I try to really um, write about. Maybe overanalyze sometimes. The anxious overthinker in me. Um, but interpersonal relationships, my faith in some cases that plays a little bit of a role. Sometimes looking at things through the lens of that, or perhaps in spite of it. Sometimes um, that's a plays. I dabble in some nature poetry. I don't often, in the same way like a Thoreau or a Robert Frost type of things. I dabble, but I haven't gotten too much into that. I tend to be
Mm.
very experiential. you know, Whatever I'm thinking and feeling, positive or negative, at least in this book,
Oh,
this has
okay.
pretty much been the case.
Yeah, it's absolutely, I mean, fine, I would say. If it works for you,
Works.
why not?
It
Yeah,
works.
absolutely. And is it necessary, do you think, to make it authentic, to go or suffer through all kinds of things? Or like you said before, I mean, what you draw from is your emotion, your experiences, and the not so nice parts of life. They
Mm.
help us become or shape us in a way like the good things do. Are they necessary even more so for someone who writes poetry than for uh, people who write fiction? I'm not talking down on fiction
Um,
because I love fiction, don't get me
no, of course
wrong.
not. Oh, yeah, me too. Yeah, I don't know if it's more necessary. I think it is definitely really important though, and
Mhm,
and at least something that I kind of strive to do in my writing is
mhm,
understanding the bad times and putting them
mhm,
in their place. And that's why ultimately because my first book actually came out in 2015 and I was really going through it in those days and it was very dark. And I think I understanding why the bad things happen and learning from them is really important.
mhm,
To pretend like
mhm,
something bad didn't happen or something negative didn't happen is just not realistic. You can't really
mhm,
bury stuff like that. Inevitably, it bubbles out, or it just kind of can, in most cases, lead to some unhealthiness. So I think understanding the past, understanding that, putting it in its right place, not to glorify it or to kind of harp on it too much. That's always the temptation. I think is maybe it's why it's got to be in the right place. It's easy to kind of get stuck in that.
mhm,
But in order to move on, I think you kind of have to process and learn from it. And by learning those lessons, especially if it's bad things that have come about as mistakes one has made, as
mhm,
I definitely have, so as to not repeat those mistakes in the future.
mhm,
And that's
mhm,
why the desolation half of my book
Mm,
exists as it is because I want to show both sides of that journey.
mm. Do you think that, thinking of all that, what you just said, do you think that we do not appreciate poetry enough?
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. I think a lot of people I think are really scared to get into their own emotions. And so, when it's uh for better or for worse, right? You like
Mhm,
feeling strong things, and things are really good. Obviously maybe it's easier, but strong emotions are scary. And in
mhm,
poetry, even more so than in with novels and things, you can kind of hide behind characters and
mhm,
kind of see it, oh, that's something happening to
mhm,
someone over there.
mhm.
When you write poetry and when you read poetry, it's right there in front of you. There really is no hiding behind it. And
It
that can be unpleasant.
it's more raw.
It's more raw. Yep, 100%.
I think a lot of people might be a bit afraid of poetry.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot
Um,
of people don't understand poetry too. I think a lot of people think of poetry as something you read in a high school classroom. And like I've
yes,
heard people say this to me before of like the I don't
yeah,
understand poetry.
yeah.
And it's maybe it takes a tuned eye to understand every nuance of it. But good poetry should be easily, at least to some degree, easily understood. If it's so enigmatic, it's probably not good.
Bit like, I don't know, a song that
Oh,
touches
very
you,
much so.
maybe?
Yeah.
And like you said, understand, I mean, maybe the comparison is completely off, but understanding science, explain it so that even a child can understand it, more or less, and make it easy for people to get into. Like you said, that's something that might keep people away from poetry. Their
Mhm.
experiences in school
Oh
when
yeah,
they,
very
yeah,
much so. Yeah,
yeah, when
because
they
people
had to
get the impression that it's all
yes, yeah,
sorry.
exactly. When your teacher asks you to interpret, of an interpretation, write an interpretation of this poem, and you write what you feel, or you try to write what you feel, or what you read, because let's be honest, two people read completely different poems, even they write completely different stories, although they read the same book,
Oh yeah.
and then the teacher says, "Oh, that's wrong."
Yeah, yeah, and that happens a lot in school when you read poetry and, like, at least my perspective, I mean, there may be something that I intended as a poet to write, but a different interpretation doesn't necessarily make it wrong, in my opinion. If you
Yeah.
glean something from it, if you can relate something to it, that's the beauty of art, I think in general. In music, we see that a lot. Music too, once the poem exists, it's kind of in the world, and you as the poet have to kind of say it's not really yours anymore in the sense that you intended something, but someone else make a different meaning out of it, and there's beauty in that. I think it's a good thing.
Mm. Yeah, I
But people
would
are burned by that school for sure.
maybe that's where the teachers should take themselves by the ears and
Yeah, it's tough sometimes, and maybe I think a little bit differently. I had some pretty good teachers in school. I mean, it's a not good ones too, but I had some good ones who really kind of opened up poetry and literature to me in general.
mhm. I would say as long as you can explain to me why you think what you think about this, word or this line or the poem as a whole, why not?
Of course, yep, 100%.
Yeah.
I think teachers and stuff say that because, like, they're trying to analyze what the intent behind the poem was, but like I said, the intent isn't always where you end up, and that's okay. That's
Exactly. I mean,
art.
we could ask you about your intent, but like you said, we can't, any longer ask poets of the past what they had
Right.
intended with their work.
Right, a lot of them didn't leave, an analysis of their own work behind to say, "Oh, this
Exactly.
is what I meant." And even if it was, maybe it's okay to get different, responses from things,
Yeah.
how we interact with that, you know?
Yeah. Or maybe we will find a letter saying, "Dear future generations, whatever your teacher tells you, he or she is
Yes,
wrong."
right. Yeah. I probably should leave maybe something like that and kinda leave that behind, so someday 100 years from now when they're teaching my stuff in classrooms I'm joking about that, but
Yeah, well, at all you could write, whatever happens to you when you read my because something does happen, does it not? When you read
Yep.
poetry, when you listen to a song, even when you listen to a speech. I mean, I'm
Yep.
not talking about whatever. Sorry, dear
No,
listeners from the
yeah.
United States. What I mean is powerful speeches.
Yes, I know what you mean.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Speech is meant to move, not meant
Yeah.
to, persuade,
Oh, you
perhaps.
think, what? What? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not the
Yeah.
speeches
We
I'm
get enough of
talking
that here,
about.
trust me, so
Yes,
I
I
get
know, I
that.
know. Yeah, what?
Um,
Uh,
but yeah, but I think getting those different, getting that a meaning out of it is a good thing. And I've had people, tell me that. Even when the first book came out, some
mm,
people I will recall one anecdote. There's a poem in here that I shared with a friend, and he was like, "Oh, that's so sad." And I'm like, "What do
mhm,
you mean? That's one of my happiest ones." And it's like, read it a different way. And once he
mhm,
explained that, I'm like, "Oh, actually, that makes a lot of sense."
mhm,
And I appreciate that because now it's like, okay, well, this is a robust piece of artwork, and that's really cool.
mhm,
I love
mhm.
when that happens.
Yeah, yeah, like we said before, everyone gets something, maybe something completely different from
Yep,
your work. You meant something different, and he or she got something different. And
of course.
isn't it like you said before, the beauty of it?
Absolutely. It's a beautiful thing. And it's always cool for me as a writer to see what people resonate with. When my book came out, I really myself as a completely unbiased author, really kind of looked at some of the epiphany poems and I'm
Mhm,
like, this is what I want to kind of
mhm,
promote, and this is what I want
mhm,
to like, you know, push more, quote unquote.
mhm, mhm,
And the more feedback I got, a lot of people's favorite poems were actually some of the like saddest ones and some of
mhm,
the ones in the first half.
mhm.
Or people would tell me like, "Oh, this was my favorite. I loved it," and I'd be like, "Really, that one? That's your favorite? Like, but this one's my favorite." um, but that's really cool to see because it's really great that if my words can impact anyone, can move
Mhm.
someone, that's really what I want, and that's an awesome thing to see.
Well, isn't it the intention of every artist to move people, to touch something inside of them, and they leave or they close the book or leave the art gallery and
Yeah,
they
that's
just
that, and that's
exhale and,
exactly it.
this feeling,
Yeah,
this wow moment.
yeah. And that's exactly what I want. To me, at least, the worst thing I could be as a writer or as an artist is forgettable. Because when I'm engaging with stuff, the worst poems I've read are not the ones that go. If I at least am maybe unsettled by something, but even like you hear a song and it's just forgettable.
Mhm,
That's one thing I don't want to do. You know,
mhm,
I might
mhm.
be notorious someday, but I would never want to be forgettable. So yeah, absolutely. I think every artist would agree with that. Most artists. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, let's say, most of artists strive for that, or they just say, writes a work for the market. Someone who writes for the market, does he or she really intend to leave, people behind with an hmm,
Yeah, and I think that's really indicative. I think that's a big difference sometimes between poetry and like novelists is
mm,
that, anyone who's writing poetry for the money is not doing it because there's not a lot of money in poetry. And that's okay. But sometimes with novels, people may try to chase the newest trend, right? Think about when Harry Potter mania was big. A lot of people were trying to jump in on that. Then, dystopia and Hunger Games stuff got really big. People were trying to jump in on that. It's not
yeah,
inherently a bad thing, but I feel like with poets there is a lot more. There's definitely trends in history, but no one's kind of chasing the payday, as it were. Um,
mm.
so I think it needs to be a little more genuine in that regard. On average, it's kind of a
And would you say that it is also, you have reached your goal, so to say, to touch people when you have a combination or a collaboration with, let's say, a musician, because turning a poem into a song, like we had in the past,
oh, I
even
think
in
that
the
would be
past,
awesome.
that happened.
Oh yeah, yeah. A lot of song lyrics are or a lot of song lyrics are just poems set to music.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
would I would love to do that like seriously one day. I sort of during COVID time I kind of got I tried to learn music, which I never
Mhm.
really did when I was younger. So there's a couple poems both in this book and in other stuff I've written that were originally meant to be song lyrics. And then I kind of fell off music a little bit and kind of focused more on the writing aspect. I just liked it more. Um, but that would be awesome.
Mhm.
I really appreciate musicians whose lyrics are musical, or other way
Mhm.
around, whose songs are poetic. Like Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan was a
Mhm.
pretty prolific
Mhm.
poet as well as a songwriter. Um, that would be awesome. I would love to do that one day.
And I guess what I've heard about Annie Lennox, and she wrote faster than Dave Stewart could turn them into songs. And she
Yes.
is also a great musician herself, and
Yep.
there's a combination of both in her.
Oh, definitely. People who can do both, I think is really awesome. I don't really have the musical mind for that as far as writing music. Um, so there's one poem in here actually that I tried to kind of turn into a
Mhm.
song.
Mhm.
My cousin is a really great, really talented musician, and
Mhm.
so we tried working on that. It never really released it in any capacity, but yeah, that's something I'd consider dabbling in more in the future.
Oh, good for you and fascinating.
Yeah.
And and I suppose it's even easier these days because of the ways the internet works and the possibilities you have
Oh
these
sure.
days, it might be even more feasible to do it than it was in the
Oh sure.
past.
Oh sure. Because you could, even if you don't know anyone, you can always jump online. There's online communities. There's ways to hire like freelancers and things like that too. If you wanted to pursue that collaboration, I guess I could do that at any point. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it. But a lot of poets also kind of run in the same circles, and so sometimes you
Mm,
just kind of get to talking with people, and
mhm,
you just kind of, things happen a bit that way as well.
mm,
At least in my experience, a lot of poets tend to be very supportive of each other. We're all kind of living the human experience in the same way. We're trying to make sense of it all. So I think there's a lot less competition per se, and a lot more
yeah, interesting
support.
that you say that. Yeah, 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 yeah. That's what I've heard rumor-wise about, let's say, the crime fiction community,
Oh yeah, yep.
unlike the romance fiction community.
I wouldn't know, but
Yeah,
yeah,
who kn
possibly.
who
I,
knows?
you know, Maybe in other genres, people are always kind of like, if you're buying one book, you're probably not buying another. I feel like
Yeah,
people who read poetry probably will like they like to read lots of
yeah,
poetry.
yeah, I
Not
would
not a
agree,
lot of
yeah.
people do, as it were, which is fine. Obviously, totally okay.
Again, I
Um,
blame it on the schools.
and that's totally fair. Now, you're not the first one ever to say that. So,
I do.
yeah, but what's it called? Yeah, I think that poetry is a lot more. We don't feel the need to compete as much, I think,
Mm,
on average.
mm. Uh, do you think that in these days, poetry, art is even more important than ever before? And what might be the
Um,
reason for that, if at all?
I would say, ooh, that's a really good question. I gotta think about that for a sec. I think that I don't know about more than ever before, but I think that definitely poetry and art is really important in today's world because two reasons I think, and I'm kind of working through these thoughts in real time. So sorry if I'm not eloquent, but I think one, we're kind of at a time right now where a lot of people are searching for meaning, even though maybe they don't even really realize it. There's a lot of the world that is maybe too commercialized, too corporatized, right? Which is not necessarily a bad thing, working a job, but people who don't maybe have as much, who aren't in touch with their emotions and kind of just go day to day. We all kind of need that purpose. We all feel things, and so maybe that's been a bit diminished in the world. And so we're reaching out for something. We're trying to make sense of it all, and poetry and art help us make sense of it. The humanities help us make sense of our humanity, as it were. I also think, and this is a bit of a side note, I guess, that with technology increasing, and you see a lot of like AI writing and AI art and stuff like that. The need for real artists and real poets to kind of um, take more center stage to combat that, I think is important. So, from a technological perspective, AI is what it is, but things like AI art and AI writing, I am obviously as an artist myself very opposed to. So, um, having our humanity there, I think is important to combat that.
Mm, I would agree so. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I would say AI can only do so much. It's not
Oh, of course.
that convincing, maybe,
It's
as
not.
we
There's a lot
think
there's a lot
it
of ways to
is.
tell.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not there yet. It's, people can tell what's an AI image and what isn't, right?
Mm,
Like, you can just tell by looking at it,
yeah.
but still.
Yeah.
I don't wanna get into all the politics
Yeah,
of that,
yeah, yeah,
obviously,
yeah. No, no, no. Of
but,
course, you don't
you
have
know
to. Yeah, yeah. I would agree. Yeah, and also the written word. I mean, using people's work to feed the machine, to feed the artificial intelligence without uh, paying them. Is it
Yeah.
theft?
I
Maybe
mean,
not theft, but it is
it's
unethical.
pretty it is unethical, yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know what legal terms you'd use, but it's not good. It's
Yeah,
definitely
yeah,
unethical.
yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely. And what I mean, the end goal, of course, so we have AI write books for us. I'm quite certain we can tell it at a certain point.
I think we definitely can, and I think because like I said earlier about, especially with poetry, you can tell who's doing it for the right reasons, right?
Mm,
Maybe something maybe not the most eloquent, but you can tell the authenticity of the emotion of the and I think it's true in prose as well, right? I
mm,
think you can
mm,
tell
yeah,
people who are really serious passionate about
yeah.
writing characters, worlds, and universes versus, either AI generated or people who are just kind of using buzzwords to chase a payday. Um, there's a difference there, I think.
Well, it might feel like, I don't know, a press release from our politicians who have all the right, words,
Yeah.
which are so fashionable at the moment. Yeah, what do they even mean? I mean, come on.
It's a lot of buzzwords, right? Because
Yeah,
people listen to it, people hone in on that. I
yeah,
think just going back to maybe the aspect of poetry people don't like to feel.
yeah.
Um, people like buzzwords and labels because it's easy to process. You can kind of
Mhm,
you have an image in your mind. You can kind of people like to put things into easy boxes, and
mm,
life's not easy, and life's not just a series of little boxes. Like life's complicated and it's messy and there's nuance, and uh, people don't like nuance in these days. I think
yeah.
um,
I think they prefer black and white, don't they? They are not
people do.
keen on the gray.
I think it's very true, and life's not black and white. So
Mm,
that just kind of uh, creates some issues there.
yeah, and like you said, you have to confront your own feelings. You have to think about what you do, what you say, what you feel. And um, there is this word we have in German, it's called Nabelschau. I mean, it's too much of it.
Okay. Yeah.
When you do it a bit too much, that
Oh,
doesn't
sure.
mean,
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't mean you shouldn't do it at all.
Right. I think I think there is the other side of that, of course. Yeah, if you are too emotional, too emotionally driven, and too
Yeah.
that can be a problem too. It's negative or positive, right? If
Mm,
you obviously if you're kind of too much in the negative emotions, you might be able to write something beautiful, but it's still probably not healthy. And so there is sort of a balance there. And I think writing, at least for me, writing helps make sense of myself. It helps
mhm,
make sense of my emotions so as to process them and kind of live better, even though my words themselves are sometimes maybe a
mm.
little over the top. That comes with the territory.
Well, it's okay with that. I'm absolutely okay with that, and it's fine. I'm fine with that. And uh, do you think that thinking of men and women, the male and female poet, is that it's important, like you said, to get in touch with your emotions. And women are often labeled as the emotional ones. And sometimes I have the feeling that it's actually the other way around, that men are far more emotional and not so rational as they believe they are, unlike the women
Yeah,
of
I
this
think on
world.
average I think on average, let me check myself for a minute here. I think on average, women have learned how to process emotions better. And a lot of men, I think, grow up with that mentality that to label something as emotional or to be in your emotions is perhaps a weakness or a you don't need to deal with that. It's sort of like that machismo, just stuff it down kind of thing, like stoic kind ofness, and that's not helpful. Like everyone has emotions. We're human, good, bad, ugly. Everyone has them, and so emotions become a lot uglier when you don't deal with them. So to ignore them or to kind of stonewall them or to label them as bad, I've been guilty of this. Don't get me wrong. In the past of I've debated whether I should write things. Be like, I shouldn't be feeling this. I don't want to write this. But to ignore something or to stuff it down is just not helpful. You can't run away from reality in that regard. You have to kind of face it, deal with it, process it, put it in its right place, and move on. I suppose move on in a healthy way, not necessarily not a just get over it kind of mentality. So yeah, and I think on average a lot of men have not learned how to do that correctly. um, then when it comes to poetry too, sometimes there's a stigma of that being a more uh what's the word, effeminate hobby or
Mm.
style of writing, and that's simply not true. Again, everyone has emotions, everyone has feelings, and it's how you express that.
I mean, what does it even mean, effeminate writing? I mean,
And
come
that's why I use
on.
the quotes on that, air
Yeah, yeah,
quotes,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Some
Yeah,
people would
yeah,
use those
yeah.
terms, but it's sort of a false, um, I don't know. It's the wrong way to label stuff like that.
I would agree because, I'm not thinking of poetry at the moment. I'm thinking of the real tough kind of fiction you read with gruesome stuff in it, and the most gruesome stuff can also be written by women, believe me.
Oh, of course. Oh, very much so.
That's
Very much so.
way of think, "Oh, okay."
Yeah.
But
That I think very much so. And that's, I can't speak for every writer, but sometimes that's a way to process things. Sometimes that's just to serve the story. But yeah, I don't think it's either a masculine or feminine thing, quote unquote.
mm.
Writing is writing. Maybe there's a correlation there I'm not aware of, but yeah.
And what about female poets? Now we said a female women are usually more labeled as emotional and so on. And where are the female poets? Uh, do they find it easier in our modern times than they did in the past? Do you think, or have you got no idea? Or have you got any insight on this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't as not a woman myself, maybe I don't have a firsthand experience of that. I don't really so I can't speak to what that looks like in the modern sense. Historically, at least just based on literature, I think it's probably easier than it's been in the past simply because there's more opportunities, there's more accessibility, right? You think about like someone like Emily Dickinson, right? One of the most famous women poets of all time. Never had anything. I could be wrong about this, but I've never had anything published in her own lifetime. Wrote everything, locked herself in a room, and never, um, never published anything. And yet is one of the most famous in history. If she were writing today, would that have been the case necessarily? Could she have maybe gotten help for if there were any mental issues? Would she have been able to find publication for her work? Could she have self-published, which is something that is relatively new in the scope of humanity? We're only in the past really only taken off in a serious capacity in the past 20 years or so maybe. Um, and so and it's hard to make it as a self-published author, of course, but you know, could someone like her have had that opportunity then that she didn't, or have that opportunity now that she didn't then? So in that regard, I think that those systems are easier than they've been historically. But I can't necessarily speak to the experience of a female poet myself. So I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth.
Yeah, understandable, but it's an interesting thought and an interesting example, Emily Dickinson. I mean, how would she fare these days. One wonders.
Yeah. I think she probably would've I think a lot of artists, you think there's a big correlation
Mm,
between, mental illness and
mm,
struggling and,
mm.
for artists, and that's
Yeah,
true for, musicians, it's true
yeah,
for, painters, right?
yeah,
Like, Van Gogh and
yeah.
people like that. With what we know about mental health and stuff, with people like that have had more help and then therefore able to make more art? I don't know. Well, I guess we'll never really know, but it is an interesting thought
Yeah,
experiment.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's an interesting thought. I wanted to ask it, playing the devil's advocate now and asking,
Yeah.
would there even be that kind of artists if they weren't dealing with mental health
Oh, I
issues?
see. I think that yeah, well, that's a really good question, actually. I think there has to be a s not there has to be. A lot of artists take their negative emotions and turn them into art, and I think that's an awesome thing.
Mm,
Um, does it need to happen? I don't know, probably. But, yeah, again, it's what you do with it, right? Do you take that and, create the art and then still separate the art from the
mhm.
artist, as it
Yeah.
were, right? I write a lot about, some of the, things I've struggled with and the desolation times, but I moved on from that necessarily
Mhm,
and didn't get
mhm,
stuck in that. And so I think that's the mark of an artist is being
mm,
able to not only turn sorrow
mhm,
into art, but
mhm,
also kind of then I don't wanna say compartmentalize it, but,
mm.
process it better
Yeah.
maybe? Which obviously
Mhm.
not a lot of artists do, and there's I think there's a beauty in that tragedy to some degree, but, it's hard to say, you know? Still tragedy is still a tragedy, I suppose.
Yeah, true. May I be so bold and ask you to read your favorite poem for our listeners?
Oh, yeah, I will actually, and I actually have one in mind, one of my favorite
Perfect.
ones. I do a lot of, open mics
Mhm.
at,
Great.
in my community. I'm very
Mhm.
involved with, the community here, so I'm gonna read one of my what a but I don't know if it's my absolute favorite, but
Mhm.
it's one that I like to read a lot. It's one that I've
Okay.
practiced a lot and could do.
Okay.
This poem is
Perfect.
called it's in the second half of the book, just kinda some background, and the poem is called Dial Tone. My dear aunt once told me, the test of loving someone is that when something good happens in your life, they're the first person you wanna tell. It's not the fluttery feeling in your heart, or the peace when they're around, or the void when they are not, the frantic crying for an entire day when you're not sure when you'll see them again, even if it's been hours since the last, till you lash out at yourself and no. The trademark, so I'm told, is a desire to share all news with them, to ask about their day or week, and genuinely care about their answer. It's not the longing for a life united, relaying stories from a joyous past, or attending gatherings of family and friends and trying to laugh with the person that's not there, or flipping through old photos and point, shouting, "See, that was me. Wasn't I adorable?" And then reminiscing some more and be embarrassed, but not wanting to stop, never wanting to stop. Instead of wanting to hear their stories too, and look at their old photos, and maybe argue, maybe cry together, but it wouldn't matter. Because at the end of the night, we both still have each other. And at the end of the night, that would always be enough. My aunt imparted that wisdom to me. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but in that moment, when it happened, all I wanted was to tell you. And that's the end of that. The
Mhm.
poem is called Dial Tone.
A wise woman you aren't.
Yes, yeah. And that is based on a true piece of wisdom um, that was imparted to me. I think it was Christmas. It might have been
Hmm.
Easter, but I think it was Christmas actually. Christmas Eve, something like
Hmm.
that. It was a while ago.
A woman with a lot of life experience.
Yes, yeah, you say that.
Oh, yeah. She
But
knew what she was talking about.
yes. Yeah, and that's a poem I read at a lot of, like I do a lot of, like, spoken events and stuff. Granted, spoken poetry and written poetry, I think, are kind of different games in a
Mm,
lot of ways,
mm,
but,
yeah.
um, that's one I like to read.
Mm,
So,
yeah. Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you. And may I also
like
ask, I mean, I usually ask it of my guests who are most of the time writers of novels, authors of novels. Uh, what would be your advice for other aspiring poets out there?
yeah. I think the biggest advice I could give to a poet, is to 1, don't be afraid of your own words, don't be afraid to write what you're thinking, what you're feeling, the story that you have, the story that you live is important and it's meaningful and it's yours. Um, and so not shy away from that. It's really easy to get kind of, and I struggle with this a lot, past days, get in your own head. Should I write this? Should I feel this? Getting through that barrier, I think, is important. And then the second piece of advice is keep trying to be better. Poetry is subjective, but there's an art to it. And so constantly kind of honing your craft and putting that time in and putting the effort in is, um, I think, really important as well. So don't be afraid of your feelings and try to make them as best as they can. Tell your story in the best way that it can be. If your story is beautiful, it deserves to be told beautifully. That's important too.
Be brave, in other words.
Yes, we say, yeah, be brave. We we say in our poetry community here when we do readings, we call it a
Mhm.
brave space, and so it's a and sort of
Mhm.
as opposed to a safe space is kind of the there. And so the intent behind that is even if it's just you in a room writing on a piece of paper, that's a brave space. Be brave about that,
Mhm. Okay.
and things can always be edited later. Don't worry about sounding ineloquent because almost never do you get a poem right the first time. So very very rare.
It's to say, I mean, it's true for every kind of written word, isn't it?
Of course, yeah, that's what so editing is for, going back through and trying to
Exactly.
make things better, and that's
Yeah.
it's a tedious part, it's the part of the process nobody likes. I don't remember who said it, but there's a famous quote, like, a lot of people like writing, or everyone loves having written, some people don't like writing, and so the process is,
Yeah.
tough, but it's worth it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Uh,
worth it.
yeah. After the creative process comes the hard work.
Yeah, and that'll come. That comes in time. Sometimes
Yeah.
it takes a while for a piece,
Yeah.
for a poem or a story or a short
Yeah.
story or a novel.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Of course. Yeah.
It's there's
Yeah.
no timeline,
Yeah.
no deadlines.
Exactly. Yeah. And James, what are your plans for the future? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I am working on a new book now. I'm kind of pretty deep in the editing process for that, so I'm can't share any details yet, but I'm hoping for a release or some. I'm hoping for a release later this year, and so I'm hoping to kind of share some of those details publicly soon. Within the next couple of months. So that's taken up a lot of my time getting kind of working on that. But I'm really excited about this one. I think there's going to be some really cool stuff in it.
Hmm. Good to know. Perfect. And congratulations on the next
Thank you.
one. And James, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know?
I mean, with regards to either the new book or if you like what you heard on this book, I always like to plug the. It's shameless, but everyone does it. You know, follow me on the socials, right? I'm on Instagram. It's at the James WA. I do have a website, which is thejameswa.com. I don't know if we can maybe put that in a description somewhere, but um, I'm also on Facebook as well. So give me a follow and walk on this journey together.
Perfect. James, it was an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. You as well. It's been awesome.
Thank you. And please don't go away. Wait for me in the green room. I will be with you shortly.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Okay. Dear listeners, I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as my guests and I did. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And I hope you will also tune in for another episode. Until next time.